Well, great. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Heidi Schlumpf. I'm the executive editor and vice president here at the National Catholic Reporter, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues who you may recognize, Joshua McElwee and Christopher White. I'll give brief introductions of them in a moment. I'm very grateful that, first of all, that you are members of NCR and support our journalism here, and that you've chosen to join us today to talk about 10 years with Pope Francis. We've been very busy in the newsroom preparing for the 10th anniversary of Francis's pontificate, which we will mark in March. We've already started with a number of stories. Michael Sean Winters, our columnist, has written a number of columns already analyzing Francis as, help me now, pastor, teacher, and reformer. And we also have commissioned a number of stories from other essayists who will be reflecting on Francis's pontificate, as well as a number of news stories by some of our staff writers and by Christopher White, who's with us today. So I just want a few housekeeping things. We'll have someone from NCR who will be moderating in the chat room and reminding you of things like the importance of using the comment chat area to ask questions. We hope to leave a good amount of time towards the end of this conversation to bring you into the conversation with your questions and comments. This is being recorded, and the recording is made available to you after our session is over. It's for your own personal use. So with that, we'll get started. We decided to hold this event today on February 28th because 10 years ago, on February 28th, 2013, the resignation of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI became effective. He had announced on February 11th. We all know the historic nature of that resignation, being the first resignation in many centuries from a pope. So the conclave began shortly after on March 12th, and after 5 ballots the next day, March 13, Cardinal Bergoglio of Buenos Aires was elected to be the leader of the worldwide Catholic Church. He took the name Francis. He was the first pope to do so, and he has been a pope of many firsts. The first pope from the Americas, the first from the Southern Hemisphere, the first Jesuit. And the past 10 years have been very significant ones for the church. NCR has been there covering this papacy and its influence, both in the United States, here in Rome, and around the world where Francis has traveled. So let's start by introducing our two panelists today who are going to give us some of their perspective as folks who have covered the Pope. Joshua McElwee is NCR's news editor based now in Washington, D.C. Previously to that, he served as NCR's Vatican correspondent from 2014 to 2021. He also co-edited alongside Cindy Wooden a book called A Pope Francis Lexicon, which is a collection of 54 essays that explore the unique words Pope Francis has used in his ministry. Joshua is a graduate of the Catholic University of America, and he has reported for NCR from 39 countries and traveled in the press pool abroad with Pope Francis 24 times. At least we think those numbers are updated. Christopher White is NCR's current Vatican correspondent. He had served as our national correspondent here, reporting from New York previously. He is also a Vatican analyst for NBC and MSNBC News. He has a master's degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from the King's College. He has a master's degree in ethics and society from Fordham University, and his bachelor's degree is in politics, philosophy, and economics from the King's College. And I love this fact about Christopher that he has reported from all 7 continents. So just a reminder again that we will be taking questions, and you can put those in the chat room. But I thought I'd start with some questions for Joshua and Christopher myself, and maybe Josh, you can go first. What's your reflection on what's been most significant about the Francis papacy so far? How is it different, or how has he changed the papacy? What would you highlight?
Well, hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Thanks for joining us. We're so appreciative of your membership and your support of NCR. It's a big question that Heidi asks to sum up 10 years of a papacy in a few moments here. I think I'll start by just remembering I was in St. Peter's Square on February 28th, 10 years ago when the resignation took effect. It was a really eerie moment. I mean, I'm sure many of you remember that we didn't expect this. We had no memory of this. I remember standing in St. Peter's Square. There weren't that many of us, maybe 20, 30 of us, the moment the helicopter left St. Peter's or left the Vatican for Castel Gandolfo in Italy, as we were waiting for the resignation to take effect, not really knowing what was going to happen next, what the cardinals might want and the person they were choosing to be Pope, and kind of where the church would go. And now it's amazing to me that we're 10 years later. We've had 10 years with this Pope Francis, who has really changed the dynamic, I think, in a lot of ways. When I look back at where the church was in 2013 and where it is in 2023, I feel there's a very different tone, a very different openness of discussion, of availability, of dialogue. I think about, Cardinal McElroy being able to write what he's writing now in America Magazine and in other places, kind of reopening conversations about the church's sexual teachings, about how the church calls people to ministry or who gets ordained in the church. I think about Pope Francis reinvigorating the synod process, hosting a number of synods throughout his papacy, now with the 3-year process for this synod that will start in October of this year, and kind of saying everything is on the table. I remember what he said at the first synod that he hosted for the family in 2014, when he asked the people in the synod hall at the Vatican to not leave anything on the table and not be afraid to speak their mind. And I think that's kind of what we've seen in this papacy, is a Pope willing to engage with what Catholics want to talk about today, asking lay people to come forward to kind of submit their ideas for discussion and to have a different kind of dialogical, open-minded church where things are discussed and not just kind of hidden away, and a really different frame of mind. And I think there's a lot of other things we could say and a lot of places where we could find fault or find things that have not been accomplished, but maybe we can talk about that more. And I'm grateful to be here with Chris and Heidi today with you all.
Chris, I see you nodding your head a lot to what Josh is saying. What would you add in terms of what you think has been significant so far?
Sure. I think, well, first, let me just echo what Josh and Heidi said. We're so grateful for all of you. Your support allows us to do what we do, to be in Rome and to be in Washington and every other corner of the globe. So thank you for making that possible. I think, Josh hit on a lot of the big sort of thematic elements of the past 10 years. And so when he was talking about that, my mind went to 2 recent events that I'll just kind of give you as snapshots. The first was back in October. There was a gathering of theologians organized by one of the Vatican departments here. And it was about a half-day seminar on listening to voices from the margins. And for the entire morning of discussion, these theologians presented papers and reports on what they had heard from listening to migrants, but also what they'd heard from listening to women and what they'd heard from listening to members of the LGBTQ community, and what they thought this meant for the church. And it was rather remarkable to me that at this conference, seated on the front row, were top-ranking members of the Roman Curia, the number 2 official at the Vatican's doctrinal office, the Vatican's foreign minister, and about half a dozen other cardinals, maybe 12 or so bishops. And the fact that these sort of open conversations could take place at the Vatican, at a Vatican-organized event, just signaled the real change in the sort of tenor of conversation that has taken place here in the last 10 years. And then just last week, I went in to interview another Curial Cardinal as a part of our 10-year anniversary coverage that Heidi mentioned. And it struck me that on his coffee table, he had copies of the working document for the Synod. It's a 54-page, report, which, raises a number of issues that were once considered taboo in Catholic church life. And here it is seated, for the taking on a coffee table of a curial cardinal, where not so long ago, some of the things contained in that document, some of the proposals would have had people investigated and perhaps stripped of their positions at universities. And I think that in that moment, I walked away from that, and that encapsulated so much of what Josh, I think, just ticked off, of this sort of change of openness and the change of processes here, this sort of inviting all of the baptized of the people of God to feel as if they have a seat at the table. And again, it's an imperfect, perhaps at times flawed process, but it's certainly a very different and new process that we see unfolding here at the 10-year mark.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm sure there's more we could name in terms of the way things have changed over the last 10 years, and many of you in the audience would have your own reflections as well about how it seems different to you. Are there things that you would identify that maybe have not changed as much as some people would have liked to have seen in the 10 years, things that he maybe would have liked to have addressed but hasn't yet accomplished? Or what are some of the limitations, if any, that you see in the Francis papacy? And I don't know which of you would like to go first. We don't always have to start with Josh, but if you have something to say, Josh, you want to jump in?
Let's identify all the problems with Pope Francis. Are we ready? I think it's obvious that this Pope has in mind a certain number of things he wants to do for the global church, and other things that maybe aren't a priority for him. And I think that's probably quite normal for any leader, any person leading an organization, let alone an organization of 1.3 billion people around the world. Clearly, Pope Francis has identified the synod process as very important to him, as something he wants to kind of reinvigorate, re-shepherd, and reopen for the global church. It's something that was envisioned, obviously, by Pope Paul VI at the end of the Second Vatican Council. Had never really, I think it would be fair to say, had never really taken root or had been really used well in the subsequent years. Clearly, that process is long, it's complicated, it's dialogical, and it doesn't always wind up in something happening that week or that month or even that year. I remember particularly reporting on the synod in 2018 for the 9-nation Amazon region. And clearly there were people in that synod that was primarily composed of bishops and lay people from the Amazon region who wanted the Pope to really make moves, particularly with regard to women in ministry and with regard to the possibility of ordaining married men or married men who had kind of lived their lives in a particular region, were entrusted by or had gained trust of the church leaders there and could take leadership of a community where there was no ordained clergy available. I think clearly that was a moment in which Francis it wasn't clear what Francis was doing. The document that resulted from that synod, Querida Amazonia, didn't really even address the issues the synod had asked the Pope to address. I think we're seeing some of the results of that now in this synod process from 2021 to 2024 in terms of the issues that are being brought forward, what we're hearing and what we're reporting on at NCR, what Chris is reporting on as the synod process goes forward, including with the preparatory document with the theologians and everyone who was gathered in Rome in advance of the synod. Also, what our correspondents here in the US are looking at in terms of how US dioceses are responding to the synod, what they're bringing forward, and kind of what's missing or what looks like there could be a missing element. So I think a lot of this papacy right now is wound up in this synod. It's wound up in how things go in October of this year, and then again in October of 2024, and then what Pope Francis decides to write or say following these two synod gatherings, what they ask of him and how he responds to those asks. I think a lot of the 10 or 12 years of this papacy are really bound up in this process now.
Yeah, good point, Josh. And look for all kinds of coverage about the synod process at NCR online. And certainly you mentioned the issue of women and possibly women's roles in ministry and leadership. I know is an important issue for many of our readers, and we have an essay that looks specifically at 10 years of Pope Francis on that issue that will be coming out between now and the anniversary. Chris, what might you name in terms of some of the limitations or things not yet accomplished?
I think my better dressed colleague has rightly identified that the Pope has really used the Synod as sort of his vehicle for getting reform through. And as a part of that, he's sort of prioritized elevating the voices of all of the people of God and allowing them to sort of partake in the life of the church at what is arguably, unprecedented levels. On the flip side of that, I think what we saw, particularly in the papacy of Pope John Paul II, and also to a lesser extent, but also very much with Benedict XVI, is he really, both of those popes really relied on the episcopacy as a means of really getting their agenda across, and particularly on, naming the archbishops who would then, recommend good bishops that would sort of carry on their agenda. And I don't see to the same extent that Francis has prioritized that. I think he's made fewer, maybe what you could maybe term legacy appointments. There are certainly some you could point to, but I do think it's quite interesting that just next month, or I guess in April, so just over a month from now, just then he will have his first appointed head of the dicastery for bishops, the Vatican office responsible for recommending bishops to the Pope. So for the last 10 years, he's sort of relied on the personnel that Pope Benedict XVI had hired for that very important office. So I think that's just, again, an area where he's chosen a different tact at sort of implementing his agenda. But because of that, perhaps the episcopacy hasn't always been in lockstep with him throughout, the past 10 years.
Yes, and you mentioned people who have not been in lockstep with him, and that includes some of the bishops. We are following a story, and we'll be reporting likely tomorrow on 2 U.S. bishops, one of whom is calling the other a heretic. What about the reaction to Francis here in the United States? On the one hand, a number of Catholics, many people in the pews say that Francis's more open style has been attractive to them and has led them to, feel more at home in the church. On the other hand, there's sort of a movement, an organized movement of many people who oppose Francis. In fact, it seems like a lot of the opposition to Francis is based here in the United States. Who'd like to address that?
Sure, I'll jump in. And one thing I'd say is, I think the opposition to Pope Francis, is very much rooted in the English-speaking world, and yes, the United States is a big part of that. I think it is a minority, but it's a vocal minority that is pretty well funded, which I think allows it to amplify some of their discontents. I think we've done a fine job, especially my colleague Brian Fraga, the past year, highlighting some of those trends and sort of the well-funded resistance to Pope Francis. I think the reasons vary for that resistance. I think, from day one when he came out on the Central Loggia, the fact that he was a Jesuit probably put some people off, or at least raised some suspicions. I think having a Pope from the global South that sort of really challenged capitalism and really had some strong things to say about the free market. I think that certainly set off a lot of suspicions. And I think in my view, that really was some of the early sort of discontents or frustrations from particularly more conservative Catholics in the US. More recently, we've seen things like the Pope's sort of crackdown on the traditional Latin Mass as a part of what he sees as the very necessary rooting out of some of these pockets of resistance to the Second Vatican Council. That certainly stirred up resistance as well. And of course, certainly the way the Pope has not overly emphasized sexual morality and taken a much more pastoral tone to questions of life and family. That is certainly a sort of I'd say, a real sharp pivot from the approach of John Paul II, especially, and also Benedict XVI. And that's where I think many American bishops in particular were very comfortable. It's what they knew for a long time. And so there's been a real adjustment, to say the least.
I mean, before I was a journalist, I worked in politics, and I think when it comes to the U.S. bishops, it kind of comes down to the fact that Francis doesn't have the votes he needs. So, you know, we cover the U.S. Bishops Conference meetings in Baltimore every year. Brian Fraga, as Chris mentioned, does a very fantastic job of covering the ins and outs of the Bishops Conference. This meeting, it was very clear that the bishops are about 20 to 30 votes away from what they would need in order to enact an agenda that is much more Francis-oriented. We saw that in the election of the new president of the conference, Archbishop Bergoglio, who is the head of the military archdiocese in the U.S. And, you know, in the Catholic Church, bishops, by and large, get to serve until they're 75, unless there is a major problem or health impediment. So Francis is dealing with a U.S. hierarchy that was appointed, still made majority-wise by his predecessors, especially Pope Benedict XVI. And we're going to be doing some reporting in coming days about the possibilities ahead in the next couple of years as the shape of the U.S. hierarchy might change as a number of substantial or important posts are coming open. And as Chris mentioned, Pope Francis now has a new official in charge of the dicastery for bishops, and it kind of remains to be seen if some of the appointments will be different and if the U.S. Church the shape of the U.S. Church might change a little bit in coming years.
Good points, and look for those pieces coming at NCR. I know I was going to ask each of you maybe what stands out as a highlight for you of covering Pope Francis. And Josh, I know you brought some props to help demonstrate some of the what it's like to be someone who covers the Pope. You want to share with some of our members?
Before I get to the lighthearted stuff, I would say that I'm seeing in the comments a lot of people ask about clergy sexual abuse and reporting on that issue. I think, you know, I had the opportunity for NCR to travel with Francis 24 times to be part of the press pool and to ask questions of him and be part of that process that Chris is part of now. And I think in my mind, a lot of the papacy of Francis kind of pivots at the point of the trip to Chile in 2015. So I remember when I think of kind of a difficult moment in the papacy, I think of being on the plane home from Santiago, Chile to Rome. It was a 17-hour flight. It's just very long. And we had a long press conference with Francis on the way home. He had really stepped in it in terms of, there was a bishop in Chile who had been accused of covering up or not responding to abuse. And it became clear during the press conference that Francis was not briefed well, was not understanding what had happened. And there was one journalist in particular who was quite, I thought, brave. It was a woman from CNN Chile. And, you know, those of us who travel with the Pope often, we know that we're going to get this opportunity a lot of times, or, you know, every couple of months to speak with the Pope. This woman, this was her one chance that she was going to have with the Pope. And she chose that she needed to ask about this bishop and that cover up. And it was very clear that Francis did not understand what she was asking, hadn't been briefed well, and gave a very pat answer. And it was really difficult as a journalist because it was a clear realization that, you know, this was not a good story, and we had to report basically that Francis was protecting for a bishop, or kind of the sense was that he was siding with the bishop over the abuse victims. But what sticks in my mind is the despair of that moment as a journalist, of knowing what was happening, getting back on the ground, and then within a week, Pope Francis sent Archbishop Scicluna, the lead abuse investigator for the Catholic Church, to Chile, and it became clear that the Pope had realized something had gone wrong. I don't know if at that point he knew exactly what, but what's extraordinary to me is to know that that man at that time was, I guess, 81 years old. It had the ability to recognize that something had gone wrong. He needed to kind of figure out what he had done wrong, and then eventually to apologize in a very open letter to the people of God in Chile as he framed it. And I think for me that there's a lot in that story in terms of what the journalism we were doing was doing, in terms of even just alerting the Pope to what he had done wrong, to reporting it out, and then kind of through the normal work of journalism causing this change, which would lead to a significant moment in the church and a real change in how the papacy would go forward. I mean, then Pope Francis would meet the Chilean abuse survivors, and it would be a different perspective. So I don't know if that's kind of what we were looking for in terms of talking about papal trips, but when I think about what it's like to travel with Francis, I do think of that moment.
Yes, quite a change from before that, and the way he dealt with sex abuse and the way he responds to things after that. So that is pretty significant. What about you, Chris? What are some of your memories from covering papacy?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Josh was saying about abuse. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm seeing from the comments here is this frustration that the response is still uneven. We've got a comment about Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which is the church's law promulgated after the big summit that Pope Francis called in Rome in February of 2019, where he invited all of the presidents of bishops' conference to the world, from around the world, to come to Rome to effectively get on the same page on how to handle these cases, particularly when it comes to cover-up of abuse by bishops. And what we've seen in the first sort of 3 years of this trial period of this new law is an uneven response. I mean, there are very clear sort of timetables established in the law about how these cases are to be handled and what time period they are to be investigated. And we're seeing in some cases a very sluggish response, and also often a lack of transparency. So to the extent in which abuse will continue to sort of loom large over his papacy, I think depends on how much these reforms can really get kicked in sort of a higher gear in the coming months and years here. And now to pivot to sort of covering him up close. I mean, I think one of the amazing things that you're privileged to see when you're traveling with the Pope as part of the Vatican entourage are just these really special encounters, and they can be everything from, I mean, we now have a Pope who is 86 years old, who's struggling with mobility issues, often uses a wheelchair to get around. And that's not preventing him from connecting with people. I mean, there was a really moving encounter when we were in Canada at the end of a prayer service he did this past July, where the Pope, who was in a wheelchair, had his assistant take him over to the other wheelchair attendees. And they just had a few moments together. And the image of seeing this Pope sort of aware of his vulnerabilities and connecting with others to sort of, just have that moment, I thought was really special. And it's a scene that will sort of stick with me for a long time. And then I think most recently to this most recent trip to Congo and South Sudan. And it was a trip to two countries with different histories, but both devastated by a lot of war and a lot of corruption. And in a place like South Sudan that is, only had its independence since 2011, it's got a population of, I think, 78% of young people that are under the age of 30. And this was the biggest event to ever happen in their country's history. And it's hard to sort of capture in words the energy and the effect that something like this has. And so to be able to have the chance to try to do that is a real honor. And it's sort of, a reminder of why these trips matter and why the Pope goes where he goes and why we go along with him.
Chris, you mentioned the Pope's health and his age, and I think people are always concerned, praying for, and wondering how he's doing. There was a report last week that he had a cold and had to cancel a few appointments. What's your sense of how he's feeling these days and how his health is? I think you said he did well on the Africa trip. Could you elaborate a little bit?
The Pope, when he was getting all these questions about the state of his health after he really had to cancel some events in the spring and in the summer because of his mobility issues, he famously quipped that it takes a brain to govern, not legs. And I think we see that very much come to play. I mean, he's about to embark on another trip to Hungary at the end of April, and he wants to go to Mongolia in the fall and India next year. So he doesn't want to be slowed down. I think getting out of the Vatican is life-giving to him. And so you asked about how he did on the way to Congo and South Sudan. I have to say the Pope only increased in energy and I'd say, motivation in a sense. He stayed at events longer as the week went along. It was a 6-day trip to very difficult locations that didn't really have some of the comforts that you might be used to when you're going to places like Canada or places within Europe. And the Pope really fed off the crowds there. He had some of the best crowds he's had in years. And I think for him, this was a moment to really connect with the people. And that is probably the best medicine or therapy he could be getting right now.
Great, thank you. And again, thanks to the members and your donations is partially why NCR is able to have a correspondent in Rome who travels on nearly all, if not all, of the papal trips and to bring you that reporting, and especially to get some of the color from those kinds of moments. Josh, did you want to add anything about the Pope's age or health, or share any other stories from your travels with him?
Josh has props.
Yeah, show the prop, show your treasures.
This is the tchotchke portion of the presentation today. When you travel on the papal plane, there's often a cover on the headrest, so you can liberate them from the headrest and take them with you at the end of the journey. So that's what that looks like. You get the papal seal in all Italia, which no longer exists now. It's what is it now, Chris? It's
ITA
Airways. And then often journalists will receive a rosary blessed by Pope Francis. So it's kind of nice. Often I would take these and give them to my family members because we had an opportunity to get them every now and again. So you can see. And then every papal trip also comes with a special medal that's minted by the Vatican. This is one of the ones I treasure. It's from the papal trip to the Central African Republic, and they all have the logo of the trip, and then also with the papal coat of arms in the back. So, in terms of the Pope's health, I am struck by what an image it is for Francis that he uses a wheelchair freely. Our Bertelsen fellow, Aleja Hertzler-McCain, did a story when the Pope went to Canada about what it meant for a person to use wheelchairs or other assistance to see a leader of the Pope's stature kind of in the public realm without any sort of, just using the aids that he needs to use in order to go about his work and his ministry. I remember from the papal trip to Canada watching the feed as Chris was on the trip himself when the Pope went to, it was a Marian shrine on a lake, I believe, and they were pushing Francis in the wheelchair and the other religious leaders were walking alongside him. And I thought it was a really moving image that, Francis was going about his ministry, and the fact that he was using a wheelchair was kind of ancillary to the fact that he was doing his ministry and taking part in this voyage to speak to what had happened in Canada and to visit with the Catholics there. I think that's kind of the through point of many of the trips abroad is Francis really finds it important to be on the ground with people. As Chris said, he really draws energy from people. When I was on the trips, journalists are often, every morning you wake up at maybe 4 or 5 a.m. to prepare for the day. And then often there are trips within the trips. So you'll wake up to go, on the trip to Mexico, every day we were taking a plane somewhere else in Mexico. It's a very big country, and Francis visited, I think, 5 or 6 different cities. And by the end of the trip, I was absolutely exhausted, knackered, completely floored. I mean, I filed my final, I remember the trip from Mexico. That was the trip where we asked the Pope about then candidate Donald Trump. And he had said, a person who builds bridges and not walls is not, or who builds walls and not bridges is not a Christian. And I remember having to file the press conference story back to the editors at NCR and being completely just exhausted. And then seeing the Pope walk off the plane as if he'd been on a summer vacation for 2 weeks. He clearly draws energy from crowds, from people being around people, and kind of seeing and getting out of the Vatican, I think, having a chance to get out of the enclave in Rome and be with Catholics, meet with people, meet with bishops, meet with regular people, and get a sense of what's going on the ground and what everyday Catholics are thinking or need in their lives.
Thank you, Josh, for sharing those insights and some of your souvenirs from your papal trips. I just want to remind all of our members who are joining us today that if you have any questions specifically for Chris or Josh, or that you would like to get their insights on or around Pope Francis, please put them in the comment section. And I have a few other questions, but I'm going to move to some of the questions that we've been getting so far. I know you guys are monitoring the comments as well. Our first question comes from our board member, Jim Purcell, and I appreciate that he's quoting from today's piece by, today or yesterday? Today's piece by Richard Gallardi. He wrote an essay in part in reflection on the 10 years of Francis, and I know, Josh, you worked with him on this piece. He quotes Richard saying, "Francis has opened wide a door that might well lead to a thoroughly reformed church, but for the most part, he's been reluctant to step through it himself." So would you like to comment on that, Josh? And Chris, maybe then you, if you have any comments, you can go as well.
Yeah, I was very grateful to Rick for writing that for us and kind of reflecting on Pope Francis's ministry at the 10-year mark. I think, you know, you can read the piece. I think a lot of what Rick is saying is we've seen Francis make a lot of symbolic gestures and a lot of moves in terms of a number of issues, but things like ordained ministry or on substantial changes to church doctrine, Francis has not made as substantial moves. And I think some of what Rick is saying is also bound up in the synod process, and that clearly this process going on right now for the synod in October of this year and then October of next year, there are going to be questions that come forward. Cardinal McElroy has laid out, I think, several of the key issues that might face the synod and kind of put them on the table, both in terms of ordained ministry, in terms of women's ministry in the church, the possibility of opening the diaconate to women or other roles to women, the possibility of talking about the church's sexual teachings. But the point I think Rick has made is that none of that has really changed. There hasn't been a substantial change to doctrine, and you know, we're at a point where Francis could conceivably walk through that door, and we have to see what happens in Rome in October and then again next year.
Thank you, Josh. And I know Josh also has covered what was called his last lecture from Rick Gallardi, who has been ill, and so we keep him in our prayers. But thank you for those comments, Josh. And any thoughts, Chris? Is he not walking through the door?
Yeah, I think Josh has, captured it well. I think, one of the things that, you hear, if you want something to die, send it to a committee. And so, the Pope has created 2 committees to examine the question of women in the diaconate. And so, that's, I think, one example. I do think that the synod process will very likely frustrate some people. The current ongoing synod will culminate with not just 1, but 2 meetings in Rome. So this coming October and October of 2024. And I suspect this first one in particular will probably irritate those that want to see a lot of issues discussed. I think this first one, in my perspective, will be a lot of table setting, because I think the Pope really wants to focus on process. And what does it mean to be a synodal church? And I think for him, you have to answer the questions of process before you get to addressing specific issues. And so some may very well see that as kicking the can down the road, and others may see it as just as a part of the process. So.
I'm going through some of the questions that we're getting here, and it seems like you might have addressed these, but a number of our members are interested in issues about women and women's leadership. about the ability to change things about women's ordination. We have a question specifically asking about women deacons. Do you have any more insights into whether some of those issues might get addressed under this papacy?
I think I'll tell a story about what it means for NCR to be in Rome and why it's so important. You may be aware that NCR was the first publication to break the news that Pope Francis was going to create the first commission for women deacons in the church. And so that was a story that, I think was important for us to do. And it was really accidental, but also the result of us being in Rome and us being an outlet that knew kind of the shape of things and how things were moving. So that didn't just happen. That came out of the UISG, which is an umbrella group of women religious from around the world, headquartered in Rome. It's basically the group of groups for women religious. So in the US, it's the LCWR, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. Above them in Rome is this International Union of Superiors General. They have assemblies in Rome every 3 years. And so as part of that assembly, often they will meet with different Vatican officials. For years prior to Francis, they had been trying to meet with the Pope directly and have an ability to ask the Pope questions. In their first meeting with Francis, they were able to meet with him person to person, but not really ask questions. But in 2016, I had been following their meetings. I had actually gone to their assemblies, I think for 3 or 4 times over those 9 or 10 years. And I had gotten wind that they wanted to ask the Pope about women deacons. And they wanted to ask Francis to create a commission on the subject. So there were 3 of us journalists who had gotten wind of this in Rome. And I would say the 3 of us snuck into the meeting. We were not allowed in. One of them was my good friend, Cindy Wooden, who wrote the Pope Francis lexicon with me. And we got into the meeting and we were there in the hall, the 6th hall. If any of you have ever been to Rome, it's a big hall where the Pope normally meets with audiences. We kind of snuck in the back and we didn't use our press passes. We just used the pass from the gathering itself so that the Vatican press office wouldn't know we were there. And I was sitting on one of the folding chairs in the Paul VI hall with my laptop on my lap, kind of pecking away. And Sister Philo Hirota, who's a Japanese sister, who is, some of you at NCR might know, she's been kind of a supporter of NCR for a long number of years, asked the Pope if he would create a commission about history of women deacons in the Catholic Church. And the Pope said, that's a good idea. I'm summarizing from the Italian, but the Pope has a very colloquial way of speaking. And he said, yeah, I think I can do that. And that was it. That was the moment. And he said he wanted to do it. He thinks he can do it. My face went bright red because I realized what had just happened. I looked at Cindy, my colleague, and said, I got to get out of here. I got to file the story. So I ran out the back of Paul VI Hall, got back to the press office and filed the story. It was a 300-word story for NCR about how the Pope Francis had just promised to the UISG, the group of sisters in Rome, that he would create a commission to study women's diaconate. And I think it says everything about the importance of NCR's presence in Rome, that we would publish that story, that we wouldn't wait for any sort of confirmation from the Vatican, but really be ready on the ground to report on what had happened. I remember several of the journalists in the press office came out and thought I was joking. They looked at me and said, Francis didn't do this. What are you doing? It's not April Fool's. And I said, trust me, it's for real. And the next day, L'Osservatore Romano, the official Vatican newspaper, had to print a story confirming what the Pope had said.
Yay for reporters who sneak into things and get the story. Someone, let's see here, Anne Neal is asking, can the Pope single-handedly decide that women can be admitted to the diaconate or priesthood? She's putting those 2 together, which I know makes it more complicated. Let's ask about the diaconate. Can you answer that?
I think your answer would require some theologians to really consider what's possible. There's a certain theologian at Hofstra University named Phyllis Sagano. I think she would argue that there is a history of women's diaconate in the Catholic Church, and there's an easier ability in terms of reopening that ministry to women. Of course, other theologians would debate whether that ministry in the early church had the same kind of standing that the diaconate for men has now. I think with regard to women to the priesthood, it gets a lot trickier.
Yes, yes. I'm excited about this question from Sister Patricia Crowley. Hi, Sister Patricia. She's saying Humana Vitae is a story close to her heart. And if you don't know why, it's because her parents served on the commission that Paul VI brought together and then didn't listen to. And so Sister Patricia is asking if we have any sense of movement to address the fact that in her experience and of so many here in Africa are not paying attention to the ban on contraception and the impact that this teaching not being received by the faithful has on people's trust in the authority of the church. This has been an issue for decades now. Any sense of movement from either of you?
Well, I'd say a few things. On the way back from Canada, the Pope was asked a variation of this question about just revisiting the church's ban on artificial contraception. And he gave one of his typically clever answers where he goes around and around and doesn't exactly respond yes or no. But he basically said, while in a sense giving a nod to the church's tradition, he said the work of theologians is to really examine these questions and elevate them for discussion. And I think many theologians heard that and felt, affirmed by the Pope that, by raising these questions that, they're not going to be silenced. And I think it was freeing for a number of them. I'd say, that's certainly been the approach of the Pontifical Academy for Life in recent years. They've done a lot of work in their formal conferences and proceedings here in Rome on the role of conscience. And the role that plays. And again, we've just seen a total shift in the conversation around this over the last 10 years under Pope Francis. There have been rumors that the Pope might write some sort of encyclical that could address this either, head on or indirectly. I can't, I have nothing to report on that at the moment. But I think by in a sense, unshackling theologians to raise this question, the fact that an entire Vatican Academy is supportive of those who do raise these questions certainly gets at one of the real shifts we've seen under the Francis papacy.
Josh, anything to add?
There's just another moment from the papal travels. I remember the first trip to Africa when Pope went to Kenya and Uganda, I think, yes. We asked him on the way back about AIDS in Africa and about whether the church's teaching might change to allow the use of condoms, particularly when the moral end was to prevent transmission of disease. I think it's a question you kind of have to ask when the Pope goes to Africa. Francis's answer will always be very stunning to me, both in its savviness in terms of how to answer a difficult question in front of a room of journalists, but also at the same time how to say something quite profound spiritually. And his answer was that he thought the question was too small. He said it reminded him of when Jesus was asked if he could heal on the Sabbath, and he listed a whole host of other things the world had to deal with. He said hunger, famine, war, disease. He said, when those things are solved, I'll answer your question.
Yeah, that's great. You can see how important these papal trips are, not just for getting out to different parts of the world and seeing Pope Francis there and meeting other Catholics on the ground, but also for these important press conferences that happen on the flight home. We have a question here, Carol Parrott, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. She said, it seems that Francis was very concerned with reforming the finances of the Vatican. Did he succeed? Did he change any of the power dynamics? Good question. Who wants to take that?
I think it's fair to say it's very much a work in progress. I think, for the first time in the past few years, the Vatican has, had publicly released audited financial materials. And I think that is considered a real shift in the way Vatican finances are made public for the outside world to see. Of course, there's been tremendous efforts to clean up the church's own house over the last 10 years to various extent. For those of you who have followed the ongoing Vatican trial, which is over a number of things, but at the very heart of it is questions about a real estate deal in London that went wrong and where the Vatican lost a lot of money. This is an effort to hold those that the Vatican has sort of pointed the finger at for corruption accountable. That trial has been going on for over a year now, and it will continue throughout the rest of this year, it seems, and hopefully they hope at least to wind down by the end of the year. And I think it's only raised more questions than it has provided answers as to sort of some of the lingering questions about transparency. I think one of the things that can be said for Pope Francis and his team is that they have invited the voices of more lay financial experts on board to serve on the Vatican's Council for the Economy and various other mechanisms and organizations here that sort of take part in one way or another in controlling the finances. But it is, I think it is one of the more perplexing and mystifying areas of an already complicated institution to cover. And I haven't gotten my mind around Vatican finances. So if any of you are great accounting experts, I'd love some tips.
Thank you, Josh. Any insights from your 7 years of covering finances?
I think I can't impart on our membership how what a strange process it is to go to the Vatican court system and to watch its proceedings. So as a Vatican journalist, we can join the pool of journalists who go to different court proceedings for the Vatican. The Vatican has its own court of law based on 1870 Italian law procedure. It's very different. It's nothing like the American system in terms of burdens of proof or how things are presented. So it's very hard to use an American lens to understand how long things take or how complicated the procedures can get. I think that's partly why this trial of Cardinal Angelo Becciu, who was formerly one of the Pope's right-hand men, has taken so long, and it's very hard for us to break through in terms of what really matters and what is more just procedural ongoings that can take a very long time.
Yes. One last question. So Jeff Hollander asked and said that I mentioned the First Things article by Bishop Paprocki from Springfield in Illinois that had the title "Imagining a Heretical Cardinal," and although it doesn't name the person he's imagining, it's clear that he's speaking about Robert McElwee of San Diego. Jeff's question is, as the people of God, how do we impact our hierarchy, the USCCB, to work more in tune with Pope Francis and be more Christian in their responses to one another? I don't know. I guess if we had the answer to that, we'd be, but any insights?
As a reporter, I often say that it's not my job to solve problems, just to cover them. So I would just sort of humbly say, Pope Francis might tell you to participate in the synod process, which I know is sort of surface level advice. But I'll leave answering those very difficult and thorny questions to someone who's not a reporter.
Which Josh is still a journalist, so maybe he's not going to give the answer either, but any thoughts?
I would just remark on what an extraordinary moment it is historically. Bishop Paprocki is writing an article in which he very clearly calls a cardinal, Robert McElwee, a heretic. He doesn't name McElwee by name, but he quotes from the piece that appeared in America magazine, word for word. He then launches into an argument based on the canons for why Bishop Paprocki thinks McElwee has espoused heresy. I think it's quite extraordinary. I know that we will have a story in the next day or two, hopefully speaking also with a historian to kind of get a sense of how strange it is in terms of a historical moment. I can't imagine any sort of bishop doing that in the 1980s under John Paul II, and there not being extraordinary consequences. And I think that also said something about the kind of church that Francis is leading, in that he would much prefer to have these dialogues and discussions and to let people have their piece and have their say, than kind of try to clamp down or threaten people with any sort of threats. But I do think it will be interesting to see, how does the next bishops' meeting in November go? Will Bishop Paprocki and Cardinal McElroy be able to speak to one another? A question I have is, if I had if I wanted to write about someone in such a way, I might call them first and say, hey, this is going to come out. I'm wondering if Bishop Paprocki had that kind of decency or that kind of openness. And I don't know. There's lots of questions I have.
I would just add that the timing of the essay is quite interesting. It comes just a week after the Vatican's congregation or dicastery for divine worship basically had to remind bishops like Paprocki about the authority that the Vatican had when it comes to limiting the use of the traditional Latin Mass, and effectively tell the bishop that he'd gotten it wrong. And of course, Paprocki is also the chairman-elect of the U.S. Bishops' Canonical Affairs Committee. So I would say the fact that he's publishing this just a week after that certainly signals that he too feels emboldened by this sort of openness in the Francis papacy, and that these articles and others like it seem to me to be very much sort of a proxy war for the larger battles taking place over the direction Pope Francis has led and is leading the Catholic Church.
Thank you so much, Chris and Josh. I know we're getting to the end of our time here, but I think this news story of today gave an example for you to draw some broader conclusions about where things have been, where they've gone in the last 10 years, and where they might be going in the future. It's been very insightful, and we're so grateful for the work that you do and the insights that you were able to bring to today's events. I see a member or reader saying, if you could, whoops, have I frozen? Whoops, okay, that we could report on solutions as well as describing some of the problems in our pages, and we will continue to do that, to report on this story and on the papacy and things going forward. I will just say, to just remind members of a few things. If you haven't already noticed, we redesigned our website recently, and with the most recent edition of our print paper, we have a redesigned a publication in print as well. And again, this is thanks to your generosity and that we've been able to make these changes. And you should have received an email yesterday, if you're a member and you're a member to be here, that talks about some changes to our membership program, in which we have a tiered membership program in which you can receive even more benefits if you'd like, such as events like this and other tchotchkes that you can share and experiences as well. So we want to say again, and I know Chris and Josh have both reiterated this, as well as from all the staff at NCR, how grateful we are and appreciative that you read us, that you support us, and that you continue to be part of the NCR family. So thank you so much for coming, and please enjoy our coverage over the next weeks as we celebrate 10 years with Pope Francis. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.